Marin Holloway used to believe that love was something you protected by being agreeable. She had met Callum Pierce 8 years earlier in a cramped campus workshop where engineering students built clumsy prototypes that rarely worked the first time. Callum had been brilliant with his hands, patient with broken mechanisms, and gentle with her when she burned her fingers on a soldering iron. He would take the tool from her carefully and murmur, half teasing and half protective, "Don't force it. You'll hurt yourself." Back then, his voice felt like safety. They married 2 years after graduation. The ceremony was small, the vows sincere, and their apartment modest but warm with the smell of fresh paint and hope. Callum found steady work restoring high-end homes, refinishing floors, repairing fixtures, installing custom pieces for clients who wanted perfection. Marin took a marketing job for a local design firm. They worked hard, saved carefully, and promised each other that nothing would come between them. But time is a patient sculptor. It chips away at certainty without asking permission. Callum's business grew. With growth came pressure, deadlines, demanding clients, and the constant hum of expectation. He came home later, shoulders tight, hands rough with splinters and exhaustion. Marin tried to help by managing invoices at night, sitting at the kitchen table long after he'd fallen asleep. She told herself this was partnership. What she didn't tell herself was how lonely she felt. The first crack in their marriage was subtle. It appeared the evening Callum dismissed her suggestion about hiring an assistant. "You don't understand how this works," he said, not unkindly, but with finality. The words stung more than he intended. Marin had built marketing campaigns from scratch. She knew about systems and growth. But she swallowed the hurt, as she often did, convincing herself that harmony mattered more than being heard. Months passed. Their conversations became transactional, budgets, schedules, client complaints. When they did touch, it was brief and distracted. Callum was always thinking about the next project. Marin was always thinking about what had been left unsaid. Then came the Hawthorne renovation. The Hawthorne house was an aging Victorian on the edge of town, owned by a wealthy widow who wanted every detail restored to its former glory. It was Callum's biggest contract yet. He poured himself into it, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark. He spoke about the intricate stair railings, the fragile plaster molding, the delicate balance required to preserve the home's character while reinforcing its structure. "It's like surgery," he said once, eyes bright. "If you rush, you ruin everything." Marin listened, nodding, but she noticed something else. The way he spoke about the house with more passion than he had shown her in months. Because the project was so large, Callum hired temporary help. One of them was Alara Quinn, a freelance interior consultant recommended by the client. Alara was sharp-eyed and articulate, with a calm confidence that made people lean in when she spoke. She specialized in historical accuracy, and Callum admired her precision. Tea first. Marin felt only mild curiosity when Callum mentioned Alara's name. It was natural to collaborate. It was professional. But curiosity turned into something heavier when she visited the Hawthorne house one afternoon with coffee for the crew. She hadn't planned to surprise him. She simply wanted to see the place that had stolen so much of his attention. She found Callum and Alara in the parlor, standing close over a set of blueprints spread across a makeshift table. Their heads were bent toward each other, their shoulders nearly touching. They were discussing whether to use two different finishing techniques on the carved mantelpiece. Marin paused at the doorway, unnoticed that Alara's voice was low but firm. "If you apply both methods at once, you'll stress the wood. It won't hold. One approach, carefully done, is enough." Callum laughed softly. "You're right. I was overcomplicating it." There was nothing inappropriate in the exchange, nothing that could be pointed to as betrayal. Yet Marin felt something twist inside her. She had not heard Callum laugh like that in a long time. Easy, unguarded. When he finally saw her, surprise flickered across his face, followed by a quick smile. He introduced them. Alara extended a hand, warm and steady, her gaze assessing but polite. "You must be the famous Marin," Alara said. "Callum talks about how organized you are. I can see why he trusts you with the business side." The compliment felt rehearsed, though perhaps it wasn't. Marin smiled anyway. On the drive home later that evening, she replayed the moment in the parlor. The closeness, the shared understanding over something so specific. She told herself she was imagining things. Jealousy, she reasoned, was a sign of insecurity, and she had always prided herself on being secure. Still, when Callum began staying even later at the Hawthorne house, a quiet unease settled in her chest. He said they were behind schedule. He said the client kept changing her mind. He said there was too much detail work to leave unfinished. Marin wanted to believe him. She truly did point one night. After midnight, she woke to the sound of Callum whispering in the living room. She lay still, listening. His voice was hushed but urgent. "No, that's not what I meant," he said. I don't want to rush this." There was a pause. "I know," he continued softly. "It matters to me too." The conversation ended quickly. When he returned to bed, he slipped under the covers without touching her. In the morning, she asked who he had been talking to. He didn't hesitate. "Alara. We were finalizing the finished schedule. The client's nervous." The explanation was plausible, professional, clean, but something about the tone he had used the night before lingered in her mind. It hadn't sounded like a discussion about what finishes. Over the next weeks, the distance between them widened. Marin found herself scrutinizing his expressions, analyzing his texts, measuring the seconds it took him to respond. She hated the version of herself that kept score point one evening. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, she tried to bridge the gap. "Do you ever feel like we're using too many tools at once?" she asked carefully. "Like we're forcing things instead of focusing on what actually needs attention?" Callum frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Our life," she said, choosing her words. "Work, pressure, expectations. It feels like we're cramming everything in at the same time. And it hurts." He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Marin, this project is temporary. Once it's done, things will settle." "But what if we don't?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was tired. "You're overthinking this." The words landed like a verdict. That night, as Marin lay awake beside him, she realized something unsettling. Love had once been the place she rested. Now it felt like something she was bracing against. Across town, in the grand parlor of the Hawthorne house, the final layers of finish were being applied with painstaking care. One method at a time, never two simultaneously, to avoid damaging the wood beneath. Marin wondered whether marriages required the same discipline. Because if you tried to force two competing forces into the same fragile space, something would inevitably crack. And she was beginning to fear that the crack in hers was no longer subtle. The Hawthorne renovation entered its final month, and with it came a tension that seemed to vibrate through every corner of Marin Holloway's life. Callum Pierce no longer spoke about the house at dinner. He answered questions with clipped updates. "We're close," or "still waiting on approval," then retreated into silence. The absence of detail felt louder than any confession. Marin noticed how carefully he placed his phone face down on the table, how quickly he stepped into another room when it buzzed. She tried to tell herself that suspicion could become its own betrayal. If she searched for cracks, she would find them, even in solid stone. Yet the unease persisted, subtle and relentless. One Friday evening, Callum didn't come home at all. At 11, Marin texted him. No response. At midnight, she called. It rang twice before going to voicemail. She left a message that sounded calmer than she felt. "Just checking in. I hope everything's okay." At 1 in the morning, she heard his key in the lock that he entered quietly, as if hoping not to wake her. But she was sitting upright on the couch, lights on, hands folded in her lap. "You didn't answer," she said, her voice steady. "We were working late," he replied, shrugging off his jacket. "Lost track of time." She asked. "Alara and I," he said without hesitation. "The client wants to walk through tomorrow. We had to finish the mantle." Marin studied his face for a flicker of guilt. Instead, she saw exhaustion and something else she couldn't quite name. Anticipation, maybe, or regret. "You could have called," she said. "I know." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry." The apology felt perfunctory, like a tool handed over because it was expected. The next morning, Marin drove to the Hawthorne house unannounced. She didn't plan to confront anyone. She only wanted clarity. If she saw nothing suspicious, she could quiet the voice in her head and move forward. The front door was unlocked. Inside, sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes suspended in the air. The house looked nearly complete. Polished floors, restored moldings, the grand staircase gleaming with careful attention. She followed the sound of voices to the parlor. Callum and Alara stood close again, but this time there were no blueprints between them. Alara was holding a small, carved wooden panel in both hands, examining the grain. Callum stood behind her, guiding her fingers along the surface. "Feel that?" he murmured. "It's smoother if you let it set before the final coat." Alara tilted her head slightly, considering. "You were right about that part." Their proximity was intimate, even if the gesture could be explained as professional instruction. Marin stepped into the room. They separated immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably. Callum cleared his throat. "Marin, I didn't expect you." I can see that, she replied. Alara offered a polite smile, but there was a new wariness in her eyes. We're just finishing up details for the walkthrough. I'm sure you are, Marin said evenly. The air thickened with unspoken words. Callum moved toward her, lowering his voice. Can we talk outside? She nodded on the front steps. The autumn wind carried the scent of dry leaves and distant rain. You can't just show up like this, Callum said, frustration edging into his tone. Why not? Marin asked. I'm your wife. He hesitated. It looks like you don't trust me. Do you want the truth? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. I don't know what to trust anymore, she said. You're here more than you're home. You talk to her at midnight. You don't answer my calls. Tell me why I shouldn't feel like something is slipping. Callum's jaw tightened. Nothing is happening. Nothing, she pressed. It's work, he insisted. You're reading into things because you're lonely. The word hit harder than he intended. Lonely, she echoed. You've been distant too, he said defensively. Always analyzing, always questioning. It feels like you're waiting for me to fail. Marin stared at him, stunned. I'm waiting for you to choose us. He exhaled sharply, as if the conversation itself exhausted him. This project is almost done. After that, we'll take a trip. We'll reset. Reset. As if their marriage were a malfunctioning device that needed to be powered down and restarted. Behind them, the front door opened softly. Alara stepped out, hesitating on the threshold. Callum, the client just arrived. He glanced back at her, then at Marin. I have to go, he said. And in that moment, Marin saw it clearly. Not necessarily an affair. Not yet, but a divided loyalty. His attention, his energy, his emotional investment were no longer singular. As he turned away, she spoke, her voice barely above the wind. Don't try to force two things into the same space, Callum. It will break something. He paused but didn't respond. Marin drove home alone, the image of them lingering in her mind. She replayed every memory of their early years, searching for the moment when they had begun to drift. Had she pushed him too hard? Had he pulled away first? The questions circled endlessly. That evening, Callum returned late again. He was quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact. The walkthrough went well, he said. The client loved it. That's good, Marin replied. Silence settled between them like dust after construction. After a long pause, he added, Alara's contract ends tomorrow. Marin looked up. And that's it, he said. The project's finished. Relief should have washed over her. Instead, she felt a flicker of dread, because endings have a way of revealing what was truly built beneath the surface. Later that night, as Callum slept, his phone vibrated on the nightstand. Marin stared at it in the dark. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to become the kind of person who searched for proof. But she also didn't want to live inside uncertainty. The screen lit up briefly before going dark again. She hadn't touched it, yet the name glowed in her memory. Alara. Marin turned on her side, facing away from him. For the first time, she considered a possibility more frightening than betrayal, that Callum might not even realize he was giving pieces of himself away. And if he didn't see the fracture forming, how could he possibly fix it? In the quiet of their bedroom, the space between them felt wider than the entire Hawthorne house, and morning, she knew, would not make it smaller. The week after the Hawthorne renovation ended should have felt like a release. Instead, the silence in Marin Holloway's house grew heavier. Callum Pierce no longer left before sunrise, yet he didn't linger over breakfast either. He moved through the kitchen like a guest, polite, careful, distant. The urgency that had once kept him out late was gone, but something else had replaced it. Distraction. He checked his phone more often than before. Marin noticed patterns because she had always been good with patterns. He would step onto the back porch when a message came in. He would tilt the screen away unconsciously. He would type quickly, then delete, then type again. One afternoon, as rain streaked the windows, she found him in his workshop in the garage, sanding down a scrap of oak that didn't need sanding. You don't have a project, she said gently. He didn't look up. I like staying busy. With what? She asked. He set the sander aside. Why does everything have to be a problem, Marin? It doesn't, she replied. But pretending nothing is wrong doesn't fix it. He exhaled, running a hand over the unfinished wood. You think I cheated? She hadn't said the word aloud before. Hearing it from him felt like stepping off a ledge. I think you let someone get closer than you realize, she said carefully. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's worse, because it means you didn't even see it happening. Callum's expression flickered, defensiveness giving way to something more uncertain. Alara and I worked well together. That's all. Do you miss working with her? Marin asked. The question lingered between them. He hesitated just long enough. I missed the project, he said finally. It felt focused. Focused, Marin repeated. On what? On something that made sense, he replied. Clear goals. Clear outcomes. If you do the work right, you see results. And us? She asked softly. His silence answered for him. That evening, Marin did something she had resisted for weeks. She opened Callum's laptop while he showered. She didn't search wildly. She didn't dig through old history. She went straight to recent messages. There weren't many, but there was one thread with Alara Quinn. The messages were brief, almost sterile. Comments about design magazines, a link to an article about historical restoration, a photo of a carved door frame she had spotted in another town. Nothing explicitly romantic. Nothing that could be held up as undeniable proof, except for one line from Callum, sent 2 nights earlier. I didn't realize how much I needed someone who understood the details. Marin stared at the words until they blurred. Alara's reply had come hours later. Details matter, especially the ones people ignore. The subtext wasn't blatant, but it was intimate. It was a shared language. When Callum came back into the bedroom, towel slung over his shoulder, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, laptop closed. You went through my messages, he said quietly. Tea wasn't a question. Yes, she answered. He nodded once, as if bracing for impact. And you didn't sleep with her, Marin said. But you shared something with her that you stopped sharing with me. That's not fair, he snapped. Isn't it? She countered. When was the last time you told me you needed me? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Marin stood. You told her she understands the details. Do you think I don't? I didn't mean it like that, he said, frustration rising. She was talking about the craftsmanship, the technical side. But you weren't, Marin replied. You were talking about yourself. The truth settled heavily in the room. Callum sat down, elbows on his knees. I didn't plan for any of this. No one does, she said. He looked up at her, eyes tired. It felt easy with her. No history, no pressure, just appreciation. And with me? Marin asked. With you, everything feels loaded, he admitted. Like every conversation is about what I'm failing at. The words cut deep because part of them was true. Marin had been measuring his absence, weighing his silences, pointing out the gaps. She had been fighting for them, but perhaps it hadn't felt like fighting to him. Perhaps it had felt like accusation. I don't want to compete with another woman for my husband's attention, she said quietly. I shouldn't have to. You're not, he insisted. Then stop giving her pieces of you, Marin said. Stop pretending emotional loyalty doesn't count. He ran his hands through his hair, visibly torn. I already told her the project's over. There's no reason to keep talking. Have you? Marin asked. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. Finally, he admitted, not directly. Marin felt something inside her settle. Not in peace, but in clarity. So you're keeping the door open, she said. It's not like that. Then what is it like? She demanded, her voice breaking for the first time. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're holding 2 things at once and hoping neither one notices. Callum flinched. She stepped back, putting physical distance between them. I won't be half of your attention, Callum. I won't live in the space you have left over. He stood, reaching for her, but she moved away. I need you to decide, she said. Not because I'm giving you an ultimatum, but because this in-between is tearing me apart. He looked stricken. You're asking me to cut someone off who didn't do anything wrong. I'm asking you to protect your marriage, she replied. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the roof like a ticking clock. The Callum's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Neither of them looked at it first. Then it buzzed again. Marin met his eyes. Decide, she whispered. The phone continued vibrating, insistent, waiting, and for the first time since the Hawthorne project began, the choice in front of Callum Pierce was unmistakably clear. The phone stopped vibrating. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound. Callum Pierce stared at the nightstand as if it were a fault line running through his life. Mara Holloway didn't move. She watched him the way someone watches a door in a burning building, waiting to see which way it will swing. He reached for the phone. For a fraction of a second, her breath caught. He turned it face down, not to hide the screen, but to mute it. Then he picked it up again, unlocked it, and walked past her into the hallway. Marin didn't follow. She stood in the bedroom, listening to the faint murmur of his voice from the living room. It wasn't hushed this time. It wasn't intimate. It was measured. When he returned several minutes later, his expression had changed. The anticipation she had once seen in him was gone. In its place was something rawer, resignation, perhaps, or resolve. I told her we shouldn't keep talking, he said. Marin searched his face for hesitation. And she understood. He swallowed. She said she never meant to complicate anything. Did she? Marin asked softly. Callum didn't answer that. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, mirroring the posture he had taken so many times before when overwhelmed. But this time, he didn't look trapped by confusion. He looked confronted by consequence. I didn't think it was betrayal, he admitted, because nothing physical happened. I kept telling myself that. Marin sat down across from him, leaving space between them. Betrayal doesn't start with bodies, she said. It starts with attention. He nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of it. I liked how she saw me, he confessed. Not as someone behind schedule or falling short. Just capable. And how do I see you? Marin asked. He met her eyes. You see everything, even the parts I'm trying to fix. The statement wasn't accusation. It was recognition. I see you because I'm invested, she replied. Not because I'm keeping score. Callum's shoulders sagged. Somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like your partner and started feeling like your project. The word stung, but Marin didn't look away. And you became so focused on proving yourself elsewhere that you forgot I was on your side. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The storm outside began to ease, rain softening to a steady drizzle. I don't love her, Callum said finally. Marin studied him carefully. That's not the question that scares me. His brow furrowed. The question is whether you were beginning to need her, she continued. Because need grows quietly. He considered that, jaw tight. I was leaning on something easy, he admitted, instead of doing the harder work here. And what is the harder work? She asked. Admitting I feel inadequate sometimes, he said. Admitting I miss who we used to be. Admitting that I don't always know how to reach you without feeling judged. Marin felt her defenses soften. Not collapse, but shift. I never wanted you to feel judged, she said. I wanted you to show up. I was afraid if I showed up imperfect, you'd see me differently, he confessed. I already see you, she replied. Imperfect and all. The vulnerability in the room was unfamiliar, but it was honest. Callum looked toward the hallway where his phone lay silent. I can't undo the emotional space I gave away, he said, but I can stop feeding it. That's a start, Marin said. He hesitated before asking, is it enough? The question hung between them, fragile and unresolved. I don't know yet, she answered truthfully. Trust doesn't reset overnight. It rebuilds the way you restore would, slowly, carefully, one layer at a time. A faint, almost rueful smile touched his lips. One method at a time. Exactly, she said. He reached for her hand cautiously, as if unsure whether he had the right. She let him take it, but she didn't tighten her grip. Not yet. I don't want two lives, he said. I don't want divided loyalties. I want us. Wanting isn't the same as protecting, Marin replied gently. You have to choose it consistently. He nodded. Then I choose it. The words were simple. The weight behind them will be tested by time. Later that night, they sat at the kitchen table, not to argue, not to accuse, but to outline what rebuilding might require. Clearer boundaries, fewer late-night silences, more transparency, even when it felt uncomfortable. They didn't pretend the conversation solved everything. It didn't, but it was the first deliberate effort in months that felt shared rather than strained. Before bed, Callum opened his phone one last time. Marin watched without speaking that he deleted the message thread with Alara Quinn. Not dramatically, not performatively, just deliberately. Then he placed the phone on the dresser instead of the nightstand. When they lay down, there was still space between them, but it felt different. Not a chasm, a gap under repair, that in the quiet. Marin stared at the ceiling and let the events of the past weeks settle into something clearer. Love had not disappeared. It had been neglected, misdirected, stretched thin by pride and fear. Infidelity, she realized, didn't always arrive as a single catastrophic act. Sometimes it slipped in disguise as validation, as understanding, as harmless connection. It asked for small permissions until those permissions became distance. Beside her, Callum shifted closer, tentative. His hand brushed hers. She didn't pull away. Forgiveness would not be immediate. Trust would not be automatic. But for the first time since the Hawthorne house, they were facing the same direction. And somewhere in that fragile alignment was the possibility, not certainty, but possibility, that what had cracked might still be restored. Carefully point one layer at a time.